Charles Manson was one of the most infamous cult leaders in American history. When his name is brought up, it is immediately followed by how manipulative he was, how evil he was, and how this quote-unquote family that he built not only created complete mayhem, but also installed fear in every single person living in Hollywood at the time. So let me tell you about it. Charles Manson was born on November 12th of 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to his mother, Kathleen, who was only 16 years old at the time. His birth certificate did not list a father, but as far as who his biological father actually was, to put it simply, he just wasn't in the picture. When Kathleen reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm pregnant with your baby," he was like, "Oh, actually, I'm busy. I have business to attend to, so I'm gonna go." And Kathleen never saw him again after that. Once she gave birth, she was struggling to give her baby a name, but she had briefly married a man named William Eugene Manson right before her baby was born, and so her baby eventually became Charles Miles Manson. That is how the Manson name came to be. Kathleen and William's marriage was a quick one. They ended up getting divorced in 1937, and by then, Charles Manson was 2 years old and already in a position in which he had no stable home. Kathleen fits into what most people would call a neglectful mother. Pretty much everything in her life, no matter how big or small, she put above Charles as far as her list of priorities went. And although she was very young and she didn't feel like she was in a position to become a parent, the one thing that you cannot deny is the fundamental truth that Charles Manson's earliest years were unstable. He was unwanted, he was shuffled between strangers, and not shown any love by the one person who was supposed to love him the most. In 1939, Kathleen was sentenced to 5 years behind bars because she was involved in a robbery. So Charles Manson was 4 years old and then sent to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. There he lived in a strict household that was, again, not a good environment for a child to grow up in. Kathleen was then released in 1942. She got Charles back in her care and she took him and moved them to Charleston. There she remarried and then tried and failed to have Charles put in foster care in 1947. Charles was then sent to Gibbalt School for Boys in Indiana, a boys' reform school, and he did not like it there, so much so that he ended up running away. When he did, he was found, he was sent back, and then he ran away again. Throughout that time in his life, he began getting in trouble with the law as well for committing petty crimes. Then he was sent to Father Flanagan's Boys Town in Nebraska, a famous institution for troubled youth. There he lasted a whole 4 days before running away. By the early 1950s, when he was in his teenage years, his norm, or what felt like his norm, was cycling through juvenile detention facilities, reformatory schools, and federal prisons. And it was in one of these facilities that he met with a counselor who described Charles Manson as suffering from, quote, a marked degree of rejection, instability, and psychic trauma. And another evaluator noted that he had, quote, developed hostility towards women. So from a very young age, warning signs were present. And one of the biggest things that showed up throughout his youth was manipulation. Charles Manson learned how to manipulate people very early on in his life. And I think an easy way to explain it is by understanding that he had never had anyone in his life who showed care or love towards him. So attention and or love wasn't something that showed up in his life. So he understood that to get it, he needed to work for it. He needed to put in the effort to win people over, to get people to pay attention and listen to what he had to say and to care about the things that he said. And he did this with his words. For example, when he was a teenager, he would practice this and he would talk to people in a certain way to get them to trust him so that then he would feel in control of the conversation and he would feel more powerful. And over time, I hate to say it, but he did become an expert at brainwashing people and making them believe whatever it was that he wanted them to believe. And by being in and out of custody, that also shaped Manson to be really comfortable with being isolated and alone. And he got arrested and convicted so many times that it was wired in his brain to not be scared of punishment. Punishment and loneliness were like the only two constants that he ever had in his life. So all of those things combined shaped Charles Manson to be an excellent manipulator who wasn't scared of much. And when you have a person like that, it becomes very dangerous very quickly. In his early to mid-20s, Charles Manson found himself in prison yet again, and it was there that he began to study Scientology. There was a Scientologist in there with him, and it's believed that Manson underwent 150 hours of the Scientology process known as auditing. Auditing is essentially a very intense form of one-on-one questioning designed to surface and clear past traumas and negative past experiences. And while he was doing that, staff members at the prison saw it as a positive thing because he was talking about his trauma and his experiences and whatnot, but Charles Manson wasn't spending time doing that to heal his inner trauma. What he was actually doing was learning how exactly the auditing process worked. From Scientology, he took the auditing process in which a person confesses their deepest fears, traumas, and secrets to another person, and essentially created a manual for how to get inside of someone's head and control them. Manson took that and later on used it to build his quote-unquote family, aka his cult following. And when I say the family, by the way, I'm referring to the cult that he created because that is what they referred themselves to be. When Charles Manson walked out of prison on March 21st, 1967, after 7 years behind bars, he was 32 years old and a completely different person than the kid who had first been locked up as a teenager. Prison had shaped him to be something way more calculated because now he was a man who had spent years learning how to read people, how to identify vulnerability, and tell someone exactly what they needed to hear to be able to gain their trust. When he got out, he headed straight to San Francisco at the exact moment that the city was exploding with this counterculture movement. At this point in time, there was an entire new generation of people who had flooded to the San Francisco area for what they called the Summer of Love. So a generation that was kind of rebelling, a generation that chose to reject their parents' values and instead was looking for a promise of freedom and new beginnings, and a newfound searching of freedom. Charles Manson, guitar in hand, with this new confidence that he had, walked directly into the middle of it. He would approach strangers and ask, "Don't you know who I am?" And just like that, the family began to form around him. He did not find followers. He found lost people and made them believe that he was exactly what they were looking for. Charles Manson successfully targeted vulnerable people, offered them a sense of belonging, and convinced them that he was a person that could teach them how to really live life the way that they were meant to. And he slowly started becoming a teacher in their eyes. And of course, in true cult leader fashion, his teachings were a mix of Scientology concepts, the Bible's book of Revelation, and his own paranoid thoughts and ideas. Among the earliest and most devoted followers of Charles Manson's were Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Charles Tex Watson, all young people in their 20s. They eventually became this group, cough cough cult, and they started spending all of their time together. And eventually they got a hold of an old school bus that they took and started traveling around California, meeting other people along the way and recruiting them to be a part of, call it what it is, cult. The bus itself was an old but converted vehicle. It had all the seats removed, there were rugs and pillows laid down in their place, and it was painted in all kinds of colors. For roughly 18 months, they wandered around in said bus around the American West, through New Mexico, through Texas, through the Pacific Northwest, and then circling back around to California. Manson called it a traveling commute. He preached from the driver's seat and around the campfires when they would stop. He convinced his followers that they were purging themselves of their egos, stripping away the conditioning of a wrong and bad society, and becoming something new, and someone free. New members joined, and the numbers kept going. Eventually, it was decided that they needed to find somewhere more permanent to stay, somewhere outside of the city, somewhere that had enough space for all of them. And they found an area in the hills of northwest LA, about 30 minutes away from downtown. It was called Span Ranch, and the family moved in and they made it their own. It was an old movie set, so there were a lot of old movie set buildings, bunkhouses, outbuildings, a barn. They found old buggies for transportation. They ran electrical wires and set up a kitchen. They made themselves right at home. Charles Manson, throughout it all, continuing to preach his quote-unquote teachings, and in true cult leader fashion, that included telling his followers that the apocalypse was coming, because of course it was. He described the isolated place in which they were living in as the place where they would wait out the end of the world. He preached that all men, including himself, were both Jesus and the devil all in one. He assigned roles and built loyalty through a system of total psychological dependence, controlling all access to food, to sleep, to the outside world. And if you know anything about the Charles Manson story, you know that this loyalty that he grew to have from his followers eventually led to senseless murders. But to understand why exactly Charles Manson ordered the murders of 7 people to happen on 2 separate nights in August of 1969, you first have to understand what he believed, or what he told his followers he believed. In late 1968, the Beatles released their double album. Charles Manson listened to this obsessively, and in his mind, the album, the lyrics of the songs were a message, specifically a message to him. He told his followers that the Beatles were prophets, and that lyrics of their songs described a coming apocalypse that he called Helter Skelter after a song on the album. For whatever reason, even though the song was written about an amusement park ride, the Manson family was absolutely convinced that it was about a race war, meaning that in Manson's mind, or at least what he claimed, was that the apocalypse would happen and take form in the form of a race war. And he said that the violence that came with it, it would be total and civilization ending. The family, meanwhile, would be safe though, of course, because they would retreat into this underground city underneath the desert, and they would go there to wait out the war. When it was over, the survivors would emerge, and Charles Manson would then be the leader of the new world. The problem, by the summer of 1969, was that Helter Skelter was not starting on its own. The war that Charles Manson had predicted and told all of his followers about was not happening, and he was getting really frustrated about this because he had this timeline in mind, and the war not happening was not in line with his schedule. So he told his followers that they would have to show them how it was done. The family would have to start the war themselves by committing murders so horrifying and provocative that they would be the start of the conflict that Manson was convinced was inevitable. He told his family members that they were going to need to commit the crimes and that he would be waiting underground, ready to rule. That was the theory that he successfully sold to Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda. And once Charles Manson announced that it was time on August 8th, they all headed down towards Cielo Drive to do what they were told. When the group got there, Tex Watson climbed up on the telephone pole at the gate and cut the phone lines. He then helped the others jump over the fence. They climbed into a house through a window, which is when Tex then announced, quote, "I am the devil and I've come to do the devil's business." And they attacked, and they did not hold back. Inside the main house, Sharon Tate, the woman who lived there with her husband, was spending the evening with some friends. She was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. That night, her husband Roman wasn't home because he was away in London for work. So it was Sharon and 3 of her closest friends, 32-year-old Wojciech, 35-year-old Jay, and 25-year-old Abigail. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, but when Tex cut out the screen and entered through the window while the others followed behind him, what followed was an act of violence so extreme that I can't even go into the details of it. By the end of the night, there were 5 victims, everyone who once had been inside of that house, as well as 18-year-old Stephen Parent. Stephen was a friend of William. William was the caretaker of the house who had been staying in the guest house. In the middle of the chaos, Stephen pulled in his car to go and see William in the guest house, but before he could even get out of his car, while still in the driveway, the group saw his headlights. Minutes after that, Stephen Parent had become the 5th victim, still in his car, still in the driveway. The group then got rid of their clothing, put on the change of clothes that they had, went back to the ranch, and went to bed. By the following morning, all of them had gone a great night's sleep. They were all well rested. They had all slept in. Then they all gathered together again to have their morning coffee. They turned on the news. Of course, the brutal murders were all over the news, and all those who had committed the murders, oh, they were so proud. They were proud and they were happy and full of joy that their murders were so brutal and so unexpected that they had made the morning news. But Charles Manson, well, he was not happy. He was not satisfied. He told his followers that they had been sloppy with the murders, way too messy. He told them that he would come along with them the following night and showed them how it was done. And he did. On the night of August 9th, the group was larger. It was the same group who had committed the murders the night prior, but now along with Manson and 2 other family members. They made their way to a random house, which was a home of 44-year-old Lino LeBlanca, a wealthy supermarket chain executive, and his wife, 28-year-old Rosemary. Charles Manson initially went inside of the home alone. He tied up Lino and Rosemary LeBlanca, and he told them not to worry, that they would not be harmed. He then robbed the entire house. And then he went back to the car to let his followers know that the victims were ready, that he had tied them up and told them to now go inside and end them. And that is exactly what they did. For weeks, the connection between those 2 murders were not made. I mean, people in the area were absolutely terrified, but authorities were so confused because both crime scenes felt so random. The break in the case did not come from the Tate LaBianca investigation at all, but from a different case entirely, because in late October of 1969, law enforcement raided Span Ranch on suspicion of vehicle theft, so nothing in connections to the murders at all, but Charles Manson, along with dozens of family members, were then arrested. Manson was in custody, but not yet charged with murder. One of those arrested also was Susan Atkins, and Susan was actually already facing charges in a separate case, the murder of Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman was a music teacher and an acquaintance of the family who had been killed on July 27th, 1969, when Charles Manson ordered for him to be. So yeah, these 2 murders that I just told you about, they were not the first. Gary's was another horrible, horrible murder, and that is what Susan Atkins was already facing charges for. While she was in jail on those charges, Susan then began talking, and she spoke a little too much to too many of her cellmates about too many of her crimes. And by November of 1969, the LA Police Department had officially enough to connect the murders to the Manson family. On December 1st, 1969, arrest warrants were issued, and on December 8th, Charles Manson was finally charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. The trial of Manson, Susan, Patricia, and Leslie combined for both the Tate and LaBianca murders began on June 15th, 1970, and became one of the most extraordinary courtroom spectacles in American legal history. It lasted 9.5 months. Manson's behavior during that trial was shocking, to say the least. He turned that courtroom into a stage for his own entertainment. Ultimately, Linda Kazavanian, the driver on both nights of the murders, became the key witness for the prosecution, and she was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten were all found guilty and sentenced to death. Tex Watson was tried separately and convicted in October of 1971. He was also sentenced to death. However, in 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled in a separate case that the death penalty then applied in California was unconstitutional, and all death sentences in the state were automatically then changed to life in prison. Charles Manson spent the remaining 46 years of his life in California prisons. He was denied parole 12 times. He gave interviews to journalists, authors, and television programs, and he continued to try and make every single little thing about him. He remained, in the eyes of the public, the most recognizable symbol of evil in modern American history. And at 83 years old, in November of 2017, Charles Manson was pronounced deceased while still in custody. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. Susan Atkins passed in prison as well in 2009 from cancer. She was 61 years old. Patricia and Tex to this day remain incarcerated, and Leslie, the youngest, was denied parole 22 times before finally being released on parole in July 11th of 2023 after more than 53 years in prison. Yeah, I'll give you a second to digest that because I know that was a lot, but anyway, that is it for me today. Let me know your thoughts. And yeah, thank you for spending time with me today. Hope you guys are having the best day. If not, go do something to make it the best day. Make somebody happy, and I will see you in my next video. Massive kiss on the forehead to every single one of you.